have trouble executing decreases as instructed in knitting patterns and you aren't getting the correct results, you may be an Eastern or combined knitter. This week's Technique Tuesday video demonstrates how to execute a variety of single decreases and double decreases if your knitting style is different than what published patterns expect. I'll demonstrate each decrease using the method instructed in most patterns, and then how to get that same result when your stitches have a different stitch mount. The first section of the video will explain the difference between Western, Eastern, and combination knitting styles. If you would like to jump right to the demonstrations of each decrease, tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to see the chapter titles and their respective starting points. Or you can use the timestamped links down in the video description. Most patterns assume a Western mount for stitches when instructing how to do a given decrease. So a Western mount means that the leading leg of a stitch, that's the leg of the stitch that is closest to the tip of the needle. If you pull on the working yarn here, you can see that it's this front one over the needle. So that is a Western mounted stitch. The leading leg is over the front of the needle. And these types of stitches are created by the knitter on the previous row around because they wrapped the yarn counterclockwise around the needle when they were forming the stitches. So if you look at the tip of the needle, you can see that that is counterclockwise. Now that would be true even if they were holding the yarn in their left hand as for continental knitting. And so they would be bringing the needle around that yarn or wrapping it around the needle. And again, the yarn would be wrapped counterclockwise. So that is a Western mount, and that is what most patterns expect. But not all knitters have stitches with a Western mount. These stitches have an Eastern mount. So the leading leg, again, if I pull on the working yarn, you can see that the leading leg is hanging over the back of the needle. The leading leg is still the leg closest to the tip, but it's hanging over the back. So that is an Eastern mounted stitch. So in order to have stitches that are mounted on the needle with an Eastern mount, that means that on the previous row around, the knitter, when they were working this stitch, whether it was a knit or a purl, whether they were knitting flat or in the round, they brought the yarn around, the working yarn around the needle clockwise. So if you look at that, the end of the tip, you can see that the yarn is going around clockwise. And again, if they were holding the yarn in their left hand, then they would come around the yarn this way, or it would be wrapped that way. And again, if you look at the needle, it's going around clockwise. And so a clockwise wrap around the needle produces new stitches on the right hand needle with this Eastern mount. Some knitters are combination knitters. So some of their stitches have an Eastern mount, like these stitches that are knit stitches below the needle. The loops on the needle above them have an Eastern mount. The loops on the needle above the purl stitches, if we get up close and look at them, we can see that the leading leg is over the front of the needle and the trailing leg is over the back. Not only do combination knitters have some stitches with an Eastern mount and some with a Western mount, the way that these stitches present when they're knitting flat is opposite of how they present when they are knitting in the round. So here is the same type of situation, but being knit in the round. And in this case, the knit stitches all have the Western mount, but the purl stitches are the ones with the Eastern mount. So that's a fact of combination knitting, that their stitches have different mounts and they are mounted opposite when they knit flat as when they knit in the round. In order to create fabric that is untwisted, like this fabric is here, you can be a Western, Eastern, or combination knitter. And the key is that as you are working a stitch, that you always enter that stitch against that leading leg, so that when you work it, it will come off the needle in an untwisted fashion. I did a whole video on unintentionally twisted stitches a few weeks back that I will link to at the top here. I'm going to demonstrate single decreases where you are working 2 stitches together, and then a series of double decreases where you're working 3 stitches all together to result in 1 stitch. I'm going to go through them and show you the Western method of working them, which combination knitters will use usually when they are knitting in the round and their knit stitches are presenting Western. And then I will demonstrate how to get that same result if your stitches are mounted Eastern. So knitters who have all stitches mounted Eastern would need to use this other method of decreasing, and combination knitters who are knitting flat would use these as well. So when a pattern says knit 2 together, they are assuming a Western mount, and they intend for you to knit these 2 stitches together as you would a normal stitch. That produces a result where the stitch on the left ends up on top of the stitch on the right. So we call this a right-leaning decrease. So you have 2 stitches and the left one ends up on top, and the result is untwisted. For an Eastern knitter, if you are instructed to do a knit 2 together, but you have stitches that have an Eastern mount, you do not want to enter these stitches in this direction. That will create a twisted decrease. Instead, you will need to remount these stitches so that they have a Western mount. And you do that by slipping them one at a time as if to purl. And so you're bringing your needle through the leading leg as if to purl and slipping those stitches in order to remount them. And now you need to return them to the left-hand needle, maintaining this new stitch mount. So you can do it one at a time or both at the same time. Now you can work a knit 2 together and end up with the same right-leaning untwisted decrease where the left stitch is on top of the right stitch. For decreases that are labeled as an sssk decrease, again, the Western mount will be assumed. What you do is you slip these 2 stitches one at a time as if to knit, and that remounts these stitches. That gives these stitches an Eastern mount. You can now work them together. You insert your left needle through the front of those 2 stitches, and then you can, if you hold the yarn in your left hand, you pick it. If you hold the yarn in your right hand, the yarn goes around the needle. It doesn't matter. What matters is how those stitches are mounted. And now what you'll see is that those 2 columns of stitches have become one, and it's the stitch on the right that ends up on top of the stitch to the left. So this is a left-leaning decrease, so that this one is on top. For you to work this decrease, all you have to do is enter these stitches as if you were knitting them together. So you're going back through the back, which is the leading leg of these stitches, and you can work those 2 together, and that creates an untwisted left-leaning decrease. So sometimes a pattern will want you to use both a right and left-leaning decrease. These are called mirrored decreases. And so you need to work each type of single decrease, usually at 2 ends of the same row. But sometimes a pattern is calling for 1 knit 2 together and that's it, in order to decrease 1 stitch in a whole row. Or they might be calling for multiple decreases. You might be doing a mass decrease, and it will tell you knit 2 together. It's saying to do that because for Western knitters, that's the easiest decrease to use. If you are an Eastern knitter or you are a combined knitter whose stitches are sitting on the needles with an Eastern mount, you can choose to use whichever decrease is easier for you, and it's likely going to be the one where you are knitting your 2 stitches together through the back like that. So in that case, you can choose to use whichever one is easiest. With single decreases, we have a left-leaning decrease and a right-leaning decrease. But with double decreases, we have 6 types of decreases. We have a left leaning that is what would be considered an extreme lean, and a right leaning that has an extreme lean. And then we have two that have more moderate leans, or moderately leaning to the left, moderately leaning to the right. And then there are two ways to do what is called a central double decrease, where it looks vertical. It doesn't have a lean to the right or left. So I'm going to go through each of those different types of double decreases, first demonstrating in the Western method and then demonstrating it in the Eastern method. So the first double decrease is a knit 3 together, and it's worked just like the knit 2 together is worked for the Western mounted stitches, only there are 3 stitches instead of 2. And so you start from the 3rd stitch and you enter through the leading legs of all 3 of those stitches, and then you wrap it around or pick the yarn however you handle the yarn. It doesn't matter. However you would complete a knit stitch, you do the same thing with these 3 stitches. And so what you'll see is that you still have those 3 stitches there, but they're all stacked. And so the one on the right is on the bottom, the one in the middle is in the center of the stack, and the one on the left is on top. These stitches have an Eastern mount, so the process is the same as it was when it was a knit 2 together, where you will need to remount these stitches and return them to the left needle before you can work what is called a knit 3 together. So you bring your working needle against that leading leg as if you were purling, and that remounts the stitches with a Western mount. You then return them, maintaining that Western mount, to the left hand needle, and then you can work them together by inserting your needle through all 3 stitches. And again, you end up with an untwisted decrease where the leftmost stitch is on top. For Western mounted stitches, you will need to remount all of these stitches. So you enter as if to knit. That remounts the stitch, all 3 of them. Now they are remounted, and you can work them together. The working needle is already through all of those stitches, and so you can just insert the left needle through those in the front, and now you would wrap or pick the yarn counterclockwise in order to create a new stitch on the right hand needle that has a Western mount. Okay, now we have stitches that are Eastern mount, and we want to do something that the pattern says is an sssk. We already have our stitches mounted with the Eastern mount, so all we have to do is insert our working needle through those stitches against the leading legs, which are over the back of the needle. So we're going through the back, but what's important is that we're going through against the leading leg. And once again, we have this more extreme lean of a left leaning decrease. So now I'm going to demonstrate double decreases that have less of a severe lean than the knit 3 together and sssk decreases have. So these are decreases that you would often see, you'll often see at the top of something. So here you have a leaf pattern where you have a left leaning single decrease and a right leaning single decrease, and then at the top you need to work 3 stitches together. And so they have a decrease that isn't as extreme as, say, an sssk would be. And this decrease is called, typically called for Western knitters, an sk2p2. The way this decrease works is that this first stitch is slipped, and these 2 are worked as a knit 2 together. And that will place both stitches over on the right hand needle, and the slip stitch will be passed over. Anytime you want to pass a stitch over another stitch from the right hand needle, it has to have an Eastern mount. So we slip that first stitch as if to knit, and that will give that an Eastern mount. We can then knit these 2 together, the regular way that we would. And then we can pass that slip stitch over the top of the two that were knit together. And that will create a left leaning decrease. The one that's furthest to the left ends up on top of the center one, and the one that's furthest to the right ends up on top of that. And that just creates less of a dramatic lean than the sssk, and it tends to be a little bit easier to do for Western knitters. So now we want to see, how do we do that same decrease if our stitches are all mounted with an Eastern mount? Well, remember, we want that first stitch to be slipped over here, and we want it to have an Eastern mount. So we want it already has the mount we want it. We just need to move it to the other needles. So we can just put our needle through that front leg and bring it over. But now, in order to work a regular knit two together, these stitches have to be remounted. So these two stitches, we slip as if to purl. So we come through that leading leg in the back, and we remount those two, and then we have to return those two to the left-hand needle, just like we would have to do for any knit two together. Now we can knit these two stitches, and now we can pass this first stitch over the top, and we end up with the same result. So the next decrease is the mirror of the one that I showed you here. It's mildly right leaning. So with this one, the way that these stitches are worked is that the two stitches on the right are worked as a left leaning decrease, an sssk, and then the third stitch is passed over those two stitches. So I mentioned with this decrease that when you are passing a stitch from the right needle over another stitch, it has to have an Eastern mount. But when you're passing stitches over from the left needle over other stitches, it has to have a Western mount. So we're going to work our sssk first, slip two stitches one at a time as if to knit so that they have that Eastern mount, and then we work them together. And now we need to return this stitch to the left-hand needle, and we want it to maintain its stitch mount. So we move it over there, and now we can pass this over. And this doesn't have to be remounted because it is on the left-hand needle and it has a Western mount. And so now we have finished that decrease, but now we need to return it to the right-hand needle. So we need to pass it back to, or slip it back to the right-hand needle. So now we have Eastern mounted stitches, and we want to do that mildly right leaning decrease. Well, we need to do an sssk with these first two stitches. They're already mounted with an Eastern mount, so we can just insert our needle through them to knit these two stitches together. But now this stitch has to be remounted, because in order to pass it over from the left-hand needle, it needs to have a Western mount. So we slip as if to purl to remount it, and then return that to the left-hand needle, and we return the worked stitch as well. And now we can pass it over, and again return this back to the right-hand needle. So we have the same result that we have over here, but we've just done it with Eastern mounted stitches. The central double decrease doesn't have a right or left lean. It is a vertical decrease. So when it is repeated every few rows, it creates a strong vertical line in the fabric. So this is shown in stockinette fabric, but it's often used in garter stitch fabric as well. And you can see that the crown of this hat that was worked in garter stitch has this strong line of vertical decreases that create this kind of star effect at the top of the crown. So there's a Western version of this decrease and an Eastern version. So I'm going to show you the Western version, which is the version you're going to see typically see in patterns. The first step is to slip the first two stitches as if you were knitting them together. So you go through both stitches. You're not slipping them one at a time. You go through both of the stitches and you slip them. What that does is it not only remounts the stitches so that they have an eastern mount, but it reorders them. That center stitch is all the way here over on the right, and that first stitch is here closer to the tip. Then the next thing you do is you knit the third stitch. So after you've knitted that stitch, you're going to pass these two stitches over that third stitch at the same time. So you're going to insert your needle through both of those stitches and anchor that stitch with your index finger so that it doesn't come off, and you pull it over. And because you've remounted the stitches, they are untwisted, and because you've reordered them, that center stitch is the one that ends up on top. For the eastern version of this decrease, you're going to knit the first stitch and then remount and reorder the second two stitches. So we knit by knitting through the back, which is where the leading leg is. And now we have to remount and reorder these two stitches, and we do that by slipping them together as if to purl them together through the back loops. It might help to look from behind to see what you're doing. You're going to enter through those back legs, and now you have reordered and remounted those stitches. Now you need to get all of those stitches back over to the left-hand needle, mounted the way that they are. So you're going to insert through the back of that. That's going to keep those mounted the way that they need to be. They have a western mount, but they've also been reordered. And then you're going to return the stitch that you actually knit over to the left-hand needle as well. And now what you're going to do is pass these two stitches over that stitch that was actually worked. So now you have completed that central double decrease, but now you need to slip this over to the right-hand needle. So that is the completed central double decrease. This video demonstrated many different types of decreases. If you would like a written reference guide for the decreases demonstrated, there's a link to a PDF document down in the video description. If you found this video helpful, you might like this playlist of videos over here. And if you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.